Imagine waking up one morning to discover that one of the wildest conspiracy theories in American history wasn't a conspiracy theory at all. Imagine learning that the Central Intelligence Agency secretly funded experiments designed to understand, and potentially influence, the human mind. Imagine discovering that people were given powerful psychoactive drugs without their knowledge, that covert research reached into universities, hospitals, prisons, and research institutions, and that much of what happened remained hidden from the public for decades. If someone had told you that story in the 1960s, you probably would have laughed. If someone had told you in the 1970s, you might have called them paranoid. Today, we know the program existed because surviving government records, Senate investigations, and declassified documents proved it. This is the story of Project MKUltra. It's a story about fear, a story about secrecy, a story about power, and it's one of the most controversial intelligence programs ever uncovered. But to understand how something like MKUltra could happen, we first have to understand the world that created it. The year is 1945. World War II has, finally, come to an end. Across Europe and the Pacific, cities lie in ruins. Millions have died. The world has witnessed the horrors of concentration camps, fire bombings, and the first use of atomic weapons. For many Americans, victory brings relief. But inside Washington, another emotion is taking hold. Fear. The alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union begins to collapse almost as quickly as the war ends. Former allies become geopolitical rivals. Europe is divided by what Winston Churchill famously called the Iron Curtain. Nuclear weapons have changed warfare forever, and both superpowers begin preparing for a conflict that everyone hopes will never happen. This new conflict won't be fought primarily on beaches or battlefields. It will be fought in laboratories, embassies, intelligence headquarters, and the human mind. By the late 1940s, American intelligence officials become increasingly concerned by reports that communist governments are experimenting with psychological coercion. During the Korean War, several captured American prisoners appear in propaganda broadcasts, making statements that shock the public back home. Intelligence officers debate what happened. Were the prisoners tortured? Were they manipulated? Had new interrogation techniques been developed? The popular term, brainwashing, begins spreading through newspapers and television, creating widespread fear that the human mind itself might become the next battlefield. Modern historians now recognize that many of the dramatic claims surrounding communist brainwashing were exaggerated or misunderstood. But inside the CIA, the fear was genuine. Intelligence officials believed they could not afford to dismiss even the possibility that adversaries were making advances in psychological manipulation. If another nation was studying how to influence memory, behavior, or resistance to interrogation, the United States wanted to understand those methods too. That belief set in motion one of the most ambitious and ethically troubling research efforts in intelligence history. The agency wasn't simply looking for better interrogation techniques, it was asking questions that sounded almost impossible. Could drugs make someone reveal secrets against their will? Could memory be altered? Could fear change the way people behaved? Could a person's resistance to questioning be weakened? Could human behavior itself be influenced under controlled conditions? Those questions would become the foundation of a classified research program unlike anything the American public could have imagined. The CIA knew that openly announcing such research would create immediate controversy. Scientists might refuse to participate, universities might reject funding, public oversight would raise uncomfortable questions. So secrecy became essential. Money began flowing quietly into research through front organizations and hidden funding channels. Grants reached universities, hospitals, laboratories, and private researchers. In some cases, the scientists receiving the money did not know the CIA was ultimately behind the funding. In other cases, they did. The public knew nothing. Congress knew very little. Even many people inside the government had never heard the name that would later become infamous: MKUltra. For years, it existed only inside classified files. Then, in April 1953, a new director of Central Intelligence, Allen Dulles, approved the program. He believed the United States was engaged in an invisible war, one where scientific breakthroughs in psychology, pharmacology, and interrogation might determine which superpower gained the upper hand. To lead this unusual effort, the CIA selected a chemist whose name would eventually become inseparable from the program itself. His name was Sidney Gottlieb, brilliant, secretive, obsessed with chemistry, and convinced that somewhere in the rapidly growing world of pharmaceuticals lay the key to unlocking the human mind. Few people outside intelligence circles had ever heard his name, but over the next 2 decades, Sidney Gottlieb would oversee one of the most controversial research programs ever conducted by the CIA. What began as a search for answers about national security would eventually expand into dozens of research projects exploring drugs, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, behavior, and interrogation. Some studies involved informed volunteers, Others did not. Many of those details would remain hidden for years. Some would never be recovered at all, because before the public ever learned what MKUltra was, someone inside the CIA made sure many of the records would disappear forever. And that's where the story takes an even darker turn. If Project MKUltra was the CIA's darkest experiment, then one man became its chief architect. His name was Sidney Gottlieb. Unlike the image most people have of a Cold War spy master, Gottlieb didn't look like a movie villain. He spoke softly, lived a relatively modest life, raised goats, practiced folk dancing, and enjoyed nature. To neighbors he appeared quiet and unassuming. But inside CIA headquarters, he was something entirely different. He was a chemist, a master of toxins, and the man trusted to answer one of the most dangerous questions ever asked by American intelligence. Could science unlock control over the human mind? When Gottlieb joined the CIA in the early 1950s, the agency was still young. Created in 1947, it had already become the centerpiece of America's intelligence operations during the Cold War, but agency leaders believed they were falling behind. Reports, many of which were incomplete or later challenged, suggested that communist governments were experimenting with psychological coercion and advanced interrogation techniques. The fear inside the CIA wasn't simply that enemies possessed better weapons, it was that they might possess better ways of breaking people. Allen Dulles believed the United States couldn't afford to ignore that possibility. Sidney Gottlieb believed chemistry might hold the answer. Within the CIA's technical services staff, Gottlieb oversaw research into poisons, disguises, concealed devices, and specialized equipment used in covert operations. But one assignment would eclipse everything else: MKUltra. Officially approved in 1953, the program wasn't a single experiment, it was a network. Over the next 2 decades, MKUltra would eventually include more than 140 known research projects, carried out through universities, hospitals, private laboratories, prisons, and research institutions across North America. Much of the funding moved through foundations and front organizations that concealed the CIA's role. In some cases, researchers knew they were working with the agency. In others, they believed the money came from ordinary scientific grants. This structure accomplished 2 goals. First, it allowed the CIA to explore dozens of different theories at the same time. Second, it insulated the agency from public scrutiny. If one project failed, or attracted unwanted attention, it would be difficult for outsiders to connect it back to the CIA. Gottlieb cast an extraordinarily wide net. Researchers studied hallucinogenic drugs, sedatives, stimulants, alcohol, hypnosis, isolation, sleep deprivation, stress, sensory overload, sensory deprivation, and combinations of chemicals that might influence memory, judgment, or behavior. Many of these ideas never produced reliable results. Some proved scientifically weak, others raised profound ethical concerns that would never be accepted under today's standards for research involving human participants. But one substance immediately caught Gottlieb's attention. It was relatively new, poorly understood, powerful enough to alter perception within minutes, and almost nobody knew what it was capable of. The drug was LSD. Originally synthesized in 1938 by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann, LSD remained largely unknown until Hofmann accidentally absorbed a small amount in 1943 and experienced vivid changes in perception. That unexpected event sparked worldwide scientific interest. Researchers began wondering whether LSD might help psychiatrists understand mental illness, or whether it could become something far more dangerous. When CIA officials learned about the drug, they saw possibilities that extended far beyond medicine. Could LSD make someone reveal classified information? Could it confuse enemy agents? Could it weaken resistance during interrogation? Could it disrupt a person's ability to think clearly? Or could it become what intelligence officers called a truth drug? The CIA wasn't the only organization asking those questions. Across the United States and abroad, scientists were studying LSD for legitimate psychiatric research, but under MKUltra, the agency pursued its own classified objectives. Gottlieb ordered large quantities of the drug. Researchers began designing experiments. At first, many studies involved volunteers who knowingly participated, but as the program expanded, documented cases emerged in which individuals were given LSD without their knowledge or informed consent. That decision would become one of the most controversial aspects of MKUltra. The reasoning inside the CIA was simple. If an enemy agent would never know they had been drugged, then the experiments had to reflect real-world conditions. To agency officials, realism mattered. To the people unknowingly receiving the drug, there was no choice. Some experienced fear. Some suffered confusion. Some believed they were losing their minds. And because they had no idea they had been dosed, they couldn't understand what was happening to them. Years later, surviving documents would reveal that these experiments were not isolated incidents. They formed part of a broader effort to understand exactly how powerful LSD really was. But even Gottlieb wasn't satisfied. He wanted to push the experiments further, far beyond laboratories, far beyond hospitals, into places where ordinary people would never suspect they were becoming part of a classified government experiment. That decision would lead to one of the strangest and most controversial operations the CIA ever conducted. It was called Operation Midnight Climax, and it would become one of the defining chapters of Project MKUltra. By the mid-1950s, Sidney Gottlieb had reached a troubling conclusion. Laboratory experiments could only reveal so much. Volunteers knew they were participating in research. They expected something unusual to happen. Their behavior was influenced simply because they knew they were being observed. If the CIA truly wanted to understand how LSD affected unsuspecting people, Gottlieb believed the experiments had to move into the real world. That decision gave birth to one of the strangest covert operations in American intelligence history. Its code name sounded almost theatrical: Operation Midnight Climax. Officially, it never existed. The apartments looked completely ordinary from the outside. They blended into neighborhoods in San Francisco and later New York City. Nothing about them suggested they were connected to the CIA. Inside, however, they had been transformed into surveillance laboratories. Hidden microphones were concealed in the walls. Recording equipment captured conversations. One-way mirrors allowed observers to watch without being seen. Every room had been carefully designed so that people inside would never realize they were part of an experiment. Then came the next phase. The CIA hired sex workers to approach men in bars and clubs. Their instructions were simple: persuade the men to come back to the apartment. Most believed they were beginning a private encounter. Instead, they were unknowingly walking into a government experiment. At some point during the evening, the visitors would be secretly given LSD without their knowledge. What happened next depended entirely on the individual. Some became confused, some laughed uncontrollably, some grew frightened, others became deeply paranoid, convinced that something was terribly wrong, but unable to explain why. Hidden behind the mirrors, CIA personnel watched and took notes. According to later accounts from individuals involved in the operation, some observers treated the sessions with disturbing casualness, drinking cocktails while monitoring reactions and discussing what they saw. To them, it was research. To the subjects, it was an experience they had never agreed to. The operation wasn't designed as entertainment. The CIA believed it was collecting intelligence. Agency officials wanted answers to questions that sound chilling today. How would someone react if they unknowingly received LSD before an interrogation? Would they become more cooperative? Would they reveal personal information? Would fear make them easier to manipulate? Could the drug weaken resistance? The experiments rarely produced the clear answers Gottlieb hoped for. LSD proved wildly unpredictable. Some people became withdrawn, others became emotional, some experienced intense anxiety, others appeared almost unaffected. The same dose could produce dramatically different reactions depending on the individual, making it difficult to draw consistent conclusions. For an intelligence agency searching for a reliable tool, unpredictability was a serious problem. Yet the experiments continued. As MKUltra expanded, the CIA explored far more than hallucinogenic drugs. Researchers funded through the program investigated sleep deprivation, sensory isolation, hypnosis, stress, chemical combinations, and other methods that might influence perception or behavior. Some projects examined whether prolonged isolation could increase suggestibility. Others looked at how fatigue or repeated questioning affected memory. The program became less like a single experiment and more like a vast collection of unrelated studies connected by one goal: understanding the limits of the human mind. Many of these projects were conducted by respected scientists at legitimate institutions. Some believed they were contributing to medical or psychological research, others knew they were working on classified government projects, but because the CIA intentionally concealed its role in many cases, tracing exactly who knew what has remained one of the greatest challenges for historians. What we do know is that MKUltra grew far beyond anything originally envisioned. By the late 1950s, dozens of sub-projects were underway, millions of dollars had been spent, hundreds of researchers had become involved, and the agency still hadn't found what it was looking for. There was no perfect truth serum, no chemical that reliably controlled behavior, no shortcut to unlocking the human mind. But despite the lack of consistent success, the experiments continued. Then something happened that changed everything. A respected Army scientist attended a retreat with CIA colleagues. During the meeting, without his knowledge, he was given LSD. 9 days later, he was dead. His name was Frank Olson, and his death would become the most controversial chapter in the entire MKUltra story. By the fall of 1953, Project MKUltra was still in its infancy. Sidney Gottlieb and the CIA believed they were racing against America's Cold War adversaries, searching for a breakthrough that could change the future of intelligence. But inside the program, the line between scientific research and human experimentation had already begun to blur. Then one decision changed everything. In November of 1953, a group of CIA officials and scientists gathered at a secluded government retreat known as Deep Creek Lake in Maryland. The purpose of the meeting was to discuss classified research involving biological weapons, interrogation techniques, and the growing MKUltra program. Among those attending was Frank Olson, a respected Army biochemist who worked with the U.S. Army's biological warfare laboratories at Fort Detrick. Olson had security clearances, worked on highly classified projects, and was considered an important member of America's national security research community. What happened during that meeting would remain secret for more than 2 decades. At the end of one evening, Sidney Gottlieb added LSD to a bottle of Cointreau liqueur without telling the people drinking it. Several attendees unknowingly consumed the drug. According to later CIA accounts, the dosing was intended as an experiment to observe the effects of LSD on individuals who didn't know they had taken it. Frank Olson was one of them. Within hours, Olson began behaving differently. Friends and colleagues later described him as deeply disturbed, anxious, and emotionally shaken. Over the following days, his mental condition appeared to deteriorate. He questioned his work. He reportedly spoke about leaving government service. Some accounts suggest he became increasingly fearful, though historians continue to debate exactly what caused his rapid decline. The CIA grew concerned. Instead of immediately informing Olson that he had been given LSD, agency officials arranged for him to meet with doctors and psychologists connected to intelligence work. Nearly a week after the retreat, Olson traveled to New York City with CIA physician Dr. Harold Abramson for additional evaluation. They checked into the Statler Hotel. In the early hours of November 28, 1953, Frank Olson crashed through a closed hotel window from the 10th floor. He died on the sidewalk below. The official explanation was simple: suicide. The case was quietly closed. His family was told very little about the circumstances surrounding his death. They had no idea that Frank Olson had been secretly given LSD only days earlier. The CIA's involvement remained classified. For more than 20 years they believed the official story. Then, in the mid-1970s, everything changed. As congressional investigations into intelligence abuses gained momentum, the CIA informed the Olson family that Frank had, in fact, been unknowingly dosed with LSD before his death. The revelation was devastating. President Gerald Ford personally met with the Olson family and apologized on behalf of the United States government. Congress later approved a financial settlement. For many Americans, it was one of the first public acknowledgments that the government had conducted secret experiments on its own citizens. But for Frank Olson's family, the apology didn't answer the biggest question: what really happened in that hotel room? Over the years, investigators, journalists, and members of the Olson family challenged the official narrative. A second autopsy conducted decades later identified injuries that some experts argued may have occurred before Olson went through the window. Others disagreed with those conclusions, and the exact circumstances surrounding his death remain the subject of debate. No court has conclusively established that Frank Olson was murdered. Likewise, the official explanation has continued to face scrutiny from researchers and his family. What is beyond dispute is this: Frank Olson was secretly given LSD without his knowledge by individuals connected to the CIA. His death occurred just days later. The government concealed the drugging for more than 2 decades. Those facts transformed Olson's case into one of the most enduring and controversial chapters in the history of MKUltra. As investigators dug deeper into the program, they began to realize something even more disturbing. Frank Olson wasn't the only victim of secrecy. He was simply the first case the public learned about. And when Congress finally started asking questions, the CIA made a decision that ensured the full truth might never be known. They destroyed the evidence. By the early 1970s, Project MKUltra had existed in one form or another for nearly 2 decades. Millions of taxpayer dollars had flowed into secret research. More than 140 known sub-projects had been approved. Universities, hospitals, research institutions, and private laboratories had participated in studies connected to the program. Some researchers knew they were working with the CIA, others did not. But outside a small circle inside the intelligence community, almost no one knew the true scope of what had happened. Then, America changed. The Vietnam War had shattered public confidence in government. The Pentagon Papers exposed years of official deception. Then came the Watergate scandal, proving that even the highest levels of government could abuse power and attempt to hide it. Washington was no longer operating in the shadows. Congress was watching. The press was watching. The American people were demanding answers. Inside CIA headquarters, officials understood exactly what that meant. If Congress ever gained access to the agency's most sensitive programs, MKUltra would become impossible to defend. In 1973, as he prepared to leave office, CIA Director Richard Helms made a decision that historians still debate today. He ordered the destruction of MKUltra's operational files. Not some of them, most of them. Thousands upon thousands of pages documenting years of classified research disappeared into shredders. Reports, correspondence, experimental results, internal memoranda, operational records, gone. In a matter of days, one of the largest intelligence research programs in American history lost much of its paper trail. To this day, no one knows exactly how many documents were destroyed, and that's what makes MKUltra so different from almost every other declassified government program. Most classified operations leave behind an archive. MKUltra left behind a void. For years, it seemed the destruction had worked. The CIA believed the evidence had vanished forever. But then something happened that no one expected. Not every document had been destroyed. Years earlier, financial records connected to MKUltra had been stored separately from the operational files. Because they were housed in a different location, they escaped the destruction order. It was a simple administrative oversight, but that oversight changed history. Those surviving budget records, contracts, and payment documents became the loose thread that investigators would eventually pull. And once they started pulling, the entire sweater began to unravel. In 1975, the United States Senate established what became known as the Church Committee, named after Senator Frank Church. The committee was tasked with investigating intelligence agencies after years of growing public concern over covert operations and government misconduct. As investigators dug through surviving records and questioned former officials under oath, a disturbing picture began to emerge. MKUltra wasn't just one experiment, it wasn't one laboratory, it wasn't one scientist, it was an entire network of secret research spread across North America. Witnesses describe projects involving hallucinogenic drugs, hypnosis, behavioral research, sensory deprivation, secret funding, unwitting participants. The public was stunned. For decades, stories about government mind control experiments had been dismissed as paranoia. Now, members of Congress were confirming that at least part of the story was true. Newspaper headlines exploded across the country. Americans who had never heard the name MKUltra suddenly found themselves asking a terrifying question. If the CIA admitted this much, what had been lost when the records were destroyed? That question has never been fully answered. Historians estimate that only a fraction of the original documentation survived. Those remaining files allowed investigators to reconstruct parts of the program, but they also revealed how much information had vanished forever. Some sub-projects can be traced in remarkable detail. Others exist only as budget numbers with almost no surviving explanation. Some researchers have argued that the destruction of the records created fertile ground for speculation. With so many gaps in the historical record, it became difficult to separate documented facts from later myths and rumors. What remains undeniable is that the CIA destroyed a substantial portion of the program's files before investigators could review them. That single act ensured that certain questions may never have definitive answers. Ironically, the cover-up became one of the biggest reasons MKUltra remains surrounded by mystery. The missing records didn't prove every rumor, but they guaranteed that historians could never tell the complete story. And as Congress continued investigating, another realization emerged. MKUltra wasn't the CIA's only controversial secret, it was simply the one that opened the door. Once that door was forced open, investigators began uncovering a pattern of covert operations that would permanently change how Americans viewed their intelligence agencies. The biggest revelations were still to come. By 1975, the United States was experiencing a crisis of trust unlike anything in its modern history. The Vietnam War had divided the nation. Watergate had forced a president to resign. Now, Congress was turning its attention toward an institution that had operated in almost complete secrecy since the beginning of the Cold War, the Central Intelligence Agency. For decades, the CIA had justified extraordinary secrecy by arguing that the nation faced extraordinary threats. Many operations remained classified because officials believed revealing them could endanger intelligence sources, methods, or national security. But lawmakers wanted to know where the line had been crossed. How much power had the intelligence community accumulated? Who was overseeing it? And what had been done in the name of protecting the United States? To answer those questions, Congress launched a series of investigations unlike anything the country had seen before. Televised hearings brought former intelligence officials before lawmakers and the American public. Witnesses answered questions under oath. Previously classified programs were discussed openly for the first time. Journalists filled newspapers with revelations that would have been unimaginable only a few years earlier. MKUltra quickly became one of the most shocking examples. Investigators confirmed that the CIA had sponsored research into drugs, hypnosis, behavior, interrogation, and other techniques intended to better understand human behavior and resistance. They also found documented cases in which some people had been exposed to experiments without informed consent. The reaction was immediate. Many Americans were outraged. Medical professionals questioned how ethical standards had been ignored. Legal scholars debated whether constitutional rights had been violated. Scientists worried that legitimate research had been permanently damaged by secret government involvement. For the CIA, the investigations marked a turning point. The agency acknowledged that MKUltra had existed. Officials explained that the program had been created during the intense pressures of the Cold War. when fears about Soviet capabilities shaped intelligence priorities. But acknowledging the historical context did not erase the ethical failures uncovered by investigators. Congress responded with reforms. New oversight mechanisms strengthened the role of congressional intelligence committees. Executive orders placed new restrictions on certain intelligence activities. Research involving human participants became subject to stricter ethical standards, building on reforms that were already emerging within the scientific and medical communities. MKUltra became a lasting example of why transparency and oversight matter. Yet even as official investigations concluded, public fascination with the program only grew. Books were written, documentaries were produced, former participants and researchers gave interviews, whistleblowers came forward. At the same time, rumors began spreading far beyond what surviving evidence could support. Some claimed MKUltra had successfully created programmed assassins. Others argued it continued in secret under different names. Still others connected the program to unrelated crimes, celebrities, and major historical events. The problem was that many of those claims relied on speculation rather than documentation. Because so many original records had been destroyed, the gaps in the historical record became fertile ground for theories that could neither be fully proven nor completely disproven. For historians, this creates an important distinction. The documented history of MKUltra is already extraordinary. It does not need embellishment. We know the CIA secretly funded research into drugs and behavior. We know some experiments involved people who did not give informed consent. We know Congress investigated the program. We know records were deliberately destroyed. Those facts alone make MKUltra one of the most controversial intelligence programs ever uncovered. Separating those verified facts from later speculation is essential, not because the documented story is less compelling, but because it is strong enough to stand on its own. Even today, more than 70 years after MKUltra began, newly released documents and historical research continue to fill in pieces of the puzzle. Yet many questions remain unanswered, not because historians have stopped looking, but because so much evidence disappeared before anyone outside the CIA knew what had happened. That leaves us with one final question. What is the true legacy of Project MKUltra? Was it a failed search for impossible scientific breakthroughs? A cautionary tale about secrecy and unchecked power, or proof that fear can push governments to cross ethical boundaries they later regret? The answer depends on how we choose to remember it, and that is where our story ends. For years, Project MKUltra existed only as whispers. People who talked about secret CIA mind control experiments were dismissed as paranoid, irrational, or obsessed with conspiracy theories. The very idea that the United States government would secretly fund experiments involving LSD, hypnosis, and unwitting human subjects seemed too unbelievable to be true. Then, the documents surfaced. Congress investigated. Former officials testified under oath. The CIA acknowledged that the program had existed, and one of the most unbelievable conspiracy theories in American history became